This is the first session in a series of 10, and we're going to dive really deep into how to use xAPI with Articulate Storyline. And if you don't use Articulate Storyline, that's okay. It's what we're going to use as the basis for these tutorials. But the real important thing is you're going to learn a lot about code and xAPI. And once you know those basics, as long as you understand your authoring tool well and you know how to execute JavaScript from it, you can adapt what you learn here and use it for a wide range of authoring tools. So you will probably need, you will want to pick up a trial of Storyline at least in later tutorials, but we'll get there when we get there. So today's session is all about how to write an xAPI statement from scratch. So you don't usually hear about this. You hear about xAPI and how great it is, but there's not many people are actually digging deep and writing the code themselves. And I think that doing that is the best way to understand it and to really understand what xAPI is when you see that word thrown around a lot. I know some of you are probably at my session last week, the xAPI 101 live session, but I'll do a quick 60-second recap for anyone new or not familiar with xAPI. It is it's a technical specification for the learning and development industry, and it tells you how to define, it tells you how to structure, send, and retrieve learning and performance data. So, it's basically just a blueprint for how to structure data, and it makes it easy for all these different tools and platforms to work together because they all adhere to the same specification. So, with that being said, I want to show you all an xAPI statement, what it actually looks like in a learning record store. And I want you to tell me what word comes to mind when you see this statement. Okay. So, it might be kind of small, but I'll zoom in. What comes to mind? Do you feel like we're in common ground here? Does this look familiar? Is it overwhelming? What do you think? Keeps going too. This is one xAPI statement. JSON, that is a good word. Codes, yes. It is definitely not standard English that we're familiar with. New language. JavaScript, yeah. This is, oh, well, yeah, JSON, yeah, you kind of gave it away, whoever said that. This is a JSON object, which is JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So I'll put that in the chat. Familiar? Okay, I see we have. Oh, I won't do that. I won't give us the, the Inception Crowdcast screen. I'll keep it over here on my second monitor. Good stuff. So I'm imagining for most of you, because I can see most of you have no JavaScript experience and have not written a JSON object before. So by the end of this session, the idea is for you to look at this and you'll know exactly what's going on. So the technical side of it and what these different quotation marks and curly brackets are here for, that's really easy. And you're definitely going to know how to work with that by the end of this call. The second piece is knowing where to put what information in an xAPI statement. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen for now. So yeah, that second piece is knowing what information goes where. And that's really what we mean when we talk about the xAPI spec, because JSON is used for all different APIs. The Experience API is just one API, and it's the primary one that we're going to be using in the learning and development industry. But JSON is used for the vast majority of any modern APIs. It's used to power your apps, power your websites. It's how you get data from one place to another on most of the modern web. So let's dive right in and start learning about JSON and how we can build those objects ourselves. Does everyone have a code editor open? Because we will need one. So just go ahead and open Visual Studio Code. That's the one I'll be using. And if you have another one you prefer to use, go ahead and use that. For those of you who are already familiar with JavaScript, this might, the beginning of this session will be a bit more basic for you, but we will dive into some good stuff. We're going to go deeper than I went in the tutorial. So I'm sharing my screen again. Once you have Visual Studio Code open, or Sublime Text, or whatever you prefer, go ahead and create a new file. So once you have the new file open and ready, go ahead and save it on your desktop or in an xAPI folder. Just call it xAPI statement.js. And if you see this second dialog box here, you don't want to save it as a plain text file. Just do all files. That will work. And then when it sees .js, it will know that we're creating a JavaScript file. So I'll just paste that in the chat. Again, the simple stuff. If you're familiar with tech, you know how to save a file. So, so once our file is saved and we're ready to work in it, we're going to create a JavaScript, a JSON object. It starts with the curly brackets. I actually need to zoom this in a bit. Give me 1 second. Anyone know? I don't know if I can zoom in on Visual Studio Code. Can you guys see this okay? It looks like it might be pretty small. Here we go. Quick Google search, save the day. Okay, this is nice. I'm guessing we can all see it pretty well now. So these curly brackets are what create a JSON object. JSON objects are made up of key value pairs. Okay, so we'll say key, and then the key and the value are separated by this colon right here. Okay, everyone with me so far? Pretty simple stuff. Again, for those who are brand new to code, we're putting these quotation marks around the word because that's what makes a string. So, you know, a string like my name, any kind of word, it's a string. It's not a number. Numbers don't have quotation marks, and variables also don't have quotation marks. So, for example, if I create a variable for my name, you don't need to know how to do this, but if I want to reference that, I would just say name. You know, if I wanted to log that, I could do console.log name, and it would print Devlin. The only important thing you need to know right now is that variables do not have quotation marks, numbers do not have quotation marks, but strings, which is the data type we're going to be working with, do have quotation marks around them. So what's the point of having a JSON object? Objects keep information together. So let's say I have a JSON object for a person. So we'll say their name is John. We can say that their age is 27. Again, we don't put quotation marks around numbers. And we can say that their hobby is reading. So as you guys can see here, this is another important piece of JSON, is that you separate data with commas. So we have this, this key value pair on this line. We're going to put a comma before diving into our second one. So these commas are important. These colons are important that are separating the key and the value. And then these curly brackets are important as well. Okay. Now, we can go deeper than this, okay? So the string can be a value, but you can also have an object as a value. That might sound confusing. Let's make this the last one. Instead of hobby, we'll make it hobbies. And let's say we want to separate that out by winter hobbies and summer hobbies and that sort of thing. So what we can do is we can just create another object here. So this is an object within the bigger object. Okay. So we'll do winter hobbies, and we'll say that is or winter hobby is skiing. And our summer hobby might be swimming. So again, you see how I separated those two key value pairs with a comma. it's contained within these curly brackets. There we go. Are there any questions about how we set this up? And is everyone able to create something like this in their code editor without any issues? Because from here, I think we're going to dive into building an actual xAPI statement now that we have these basics down. Yes, created. Okay, good. So speak up at any time. It's only going to get more, maybe possibly more complex from here. So let's do it. We're going to scratch this, and we're going to start building the xAPI statement object. Because again, xAPI data is sent in the form of statements, and all an xAPI statement is a JSON object. It contains many objects itself, but it is an object. So we'll start with those two curly brackets to create the framework for our object. Now, does anyone know what the three primary components of an xAPI statement is? I know there are some people who are more advanced here, so let's just see in the chat. Who knows the three necessary elements to create an xAPI statement? Object, that's one of them. So we need three. So we have an object. Actor, yes, we're missing the middle one. Actor, verb, object. There we go. Yes, so Devlin did this, I did this, Devlin ate a sandwich, actor, verb, object. So each of those are going to be their own objects within this xAPI statement object. So let's go ahead and type that out. So we know we have an actor, and the value for this actor will be an object, okay? So we're going to leave that object empty for now, and we're going to add a comma, and then we'll do verb, colon, create the verb object. I'm going to leave that empty for now as well, comma, and then we're going to create the object. And again, that's obviously makes it more confusing because these are JSON objects, and the xAPI statement has an object, but you'll just have to know which one I'm referring to based off of the context here. So this is our framework for our entire xAPI statement. Actor, verb, and object. And within these objects here, we're going to add more detail about what's happening in this statement. So everyone, go ahead and make sure you have this in your file, because we're only going to move on from here. So I'm not seeing any questions, so we're going to move on. Don't be afraid to ask if you get behind a little bit. And you see how I'm indenting this too. I mean, I guess that's a little helpful. I'm just using tab here. You can also just add a couple of spaces. It's really preference. But it's helpful to see how things are nested. So, you can just look down this line and see, oh yeah, we have actor as a child. Maybe I should explain that too. These are children of the statement object. So, the actor is the first level in this one. So is the verb, so is the object. So we're going to start adding some details to this actor. So we want to know their name, right? We want to know who's actually performing this action in this xAPI statement. So the name will be Devlin, add whatever name you'd like. Or I guess add whatever name your name is. So once we're done with that, we're going to identify ourselves with an email address. Now this is, again, these possible things that we can put here are mandated by the xAPI spec. So the xAPI specification says, yes, you can include a name for this actor. We can also include an email address by including this mbox property, short for mailbox. And you have to word it like this to keep it in line with the xAPI specification. So obviously, in this one session, you're not going to memorize all of these things that are xAPI specific, but it is very easy to just Google an example of an xAPI object whenever it comes down to coding one yourself, and you'll know what it's talking about now. So mbox is mailbox, and to put that email address, you have to actually start it with mail to. If anyone is familiar with web development, okay, does order matter? I don't think so. I mean, I always put it like this, active verb object, because that's intuitive, but no, order doesn't matter. Like, because there are additional properties you can add on here. And you can add them in whatever order you want. So order isn't important here. This is just the most intuitive. Is it necessary to use the space after the colon? No, it is not. I'll just do it for readability. Spaces aren't important. Adding spaces or tabs, that doesn't have any influence on how this code will execute. So, I could even have name Devlin. I could have it be way out here, and it's still going to be fine. The code's still going to work. I wouldn't add spaces inside of this, because this is the data that's actually getting sent. So, no, spaces don't matter. Yeah. The main things to worry about are just the colons, the brackets, quotes. Those are the important things to look at. The commas are really important, because your code won't work if you forget one of these commas, or commas, sorry. So mail to, and then you just put an email address. Yeah, if you're familiar with web development, you can add links to websites and stuff, or when you click it, it opens up your email client. You do that by adding this mail to phrase here. So this is a common web development construct. It might be new to some of you, but it's just something you have to remember. And again, I think for the first year I was working with xAPI, I would just pull up things to reference as I build the statements, just so I don't mess up some small detail. And I'm sure I have done that in the past. Are you allowed to make up your own properties, or does xAPI only expect and handle a limited list of key value pairs? Good question, Joe. There are places where you can add your own data that isn't mandated by the xAPI spec, and that's why it's so flexible. Places like this, like when you're defining the actor, there are specific ways to do this. And I'll show you what I look at whenever I need to do something like this. You can just Google like xAPI actor, okay? And xAPI.com has such good deep dive articles for each of these possible objects. Like you see what we're looking at so far. They have an actor deep dive, a verb deep dive, an object deep dive, and pretty much any part of an xAPI statement on xAPI.com, there's a deep dive. And see, they give examples like we're looking at. They talk about different ways that you can identify actors. So this is a really good resource when you're actually digging into this on your own. Because we can also identify the actor with an account. So I'll show you a quick example of it here. I'm sure there is one. Okay, so here's an account. So see, we use name and mailbox, but instead we can say, oh, we're going to identify this with an account, and that can be something like Twitter. So, you would put, the home page is twitter.com, and the name would be whatever your Twitter handle is. And so that's really flexible too. But we're just going to stick with email address here, since that's the most common way. And you can pull an email address from a learning management system. So this is a pretty common way to identify the actor. So I'm going to look over at the Crowdcast and make sure that we're good to continue. Okay. So this is it. So this is all we need for the actor object. There is another property here that's good to add, which is actor type. Let me make sure. See, like I'm even going to pull up a reference just to make sure I don't spell something wrong and it's whatever. So actor or object type. See, yeah. So I still use a reference. Like it's like most coding you do. Most full-time software developers, you're always using references and stuff. It's not like you're holding everything up in memory. But what I have found is that as you do it more, there's a whole lot more you can pull from memory. And that's like, for me at least, the most motivating thing about learning to code is when you're first doing it, you have to basically be copying it from a resource. But as you get more comfortable, you're like just banging it out, like you're just typing an essay. And that's a pretty motivating part that some of you probably have or will experience. So with this object type property, we're basically defining in the statement that this actor is a single person. It's a single agent. Okay, the alternative here is a group. Sorry. So you could also be a group. And this would be like if a team is doing something. So say this team, we want to send an xAPI statement saying that this team won the office-wide competition. We would define that differently, but we're just going to keep it simple for now. Object type is going to be an agent. So again, this isn't mandatory, but it's just good to add these little things to make the xAPI statement more clear because if this did start getting pulled into data with groups having statements too, and you didn't define this so clearly, it would be confusing for systems and people trying to analyze it. So we'll move on to the verb now. The actor was easy enough. Let's start with the verb. So all verbs need to have an ID, okay? This is a new concept, so listen up. The IDs need to be unique identifiers. So they're called URIs, or I think it's like a unique universal resource identifier. It's kind of like a URL, but it doesn't need to actually resolve to a website. Okay, it will look like a URL. Like, for example, we'll do one. So we'll say that this is crowdcast/xAPI statement. Oh no, this is for a verb, sorry. So we'll say I make this new verb, devinpec.com/presented. So there are some best practices with setting this ID. What you'll probably do in 99% of the times is pull this ID from the registry. So there are a couple of them, but this is a good one. It's registry.tincanapi.com. I'm going to go ahead and post this in the chat. So you can get a standard list of activity types, extensions, stuff like that. Don't look at those right now. We're focused on verbs. So look at these tabs at the top that are separating what you see in the registry. We want to look at the Verbs tab. And this is going to show you a list of all of the verbs that already have publicly accepted use cases within the xAPI specification. Did I make up that verb ID? Yes, I made up this verb ID. So jumping back over here, this is a valid verb ID, but I probably wouldn't want to use that because I'm only using my own domain right here. And that's the second piece. If you don't use a verb ID that's already agreed upon by the public, you want to use an ID that is a domain you control. So I'm doing this on devinpec.com because if I wanted to put up a public site and I would put up a page up saying how I use this presented verb and how I recommend other people use it, I can do so. If I use some other random thing like myverbs.com, that's someone else's domain. I don't want to start and then they might use their domain to define this differently. So if you do set your own ID, make sure you're using your own domain to do so. And again, it doesn't have to resolve anywhere. It's just to help you. It's just so that every time you use this verb to have this meaning, you would use this same ID. So yeah, the registry is a great source. So let's see so I want to say I presented. Let's see. Sure enough, I just did Control F and search for presented. And here's the verb. It indicates that the actor has presented the object. For instance, when a person gives a presentation at a conference. So you see, they already have this verb here for me. They already have a URI for it. So I would just copy this and use this. I don't want to make my own. I don't want to add a new verb when there's already a publicly accepted or ID for it. So now I'll be using this verb ID in my app or my presentation or whatever it is, and maybe someone else or maybe someone else at my organization is using xAPI to track who's presenting things. They would use this same verb. So then if at my organization, I want to query, I want to look at the data and see, let's look at everyone who presented something in the last 30 days. All of the teams would presumably be using this verb ID. So it would be really easy to query all of that at once. So that's why it's so important to try to use these publicly accepted identifiers because xAPI is supposed to be interoperable. And when you're using definitions that the community agrees on, you're doing your part in keeping things interoperable. So I hope everyone's on board with that. Query means view the data inside the LRS. Yeah, what querying the LRS is when you pull the data from the LRS and look at it. There are tools you can use inside the LRS, like charts and stuff that would still rely on, you would put, create a chart showing me everyone who completed this verb. You would still need to input this verb ID, and that's how you would display things in the LRS. But you don't have to view it in the LRS. You can also query an LRS and kind of show all of that data in a statement. And we're going to get there in the 9th session. So 9 weeks we'll be there, and I'll show you how to pull the data from the LRS and use that data in a learning experience or something like that. But okay, we spent a lot of time on ID, but this is a really important concept in xAPI. So where we're going from here is the we need to actually add some human language to describe. Let me just pull up my code. Sorry. Oh yeah, here it is. Okay, so we have the ID. Now we need display. Okay, this is where it's easy for humans to read. So we look at this. No one wants to look at URLs and try to make sense of what verb was used here, even though it's usually the last word. We want to put it in some nice human readable language so that when we're looking at our statement stream in the LRS, it just says Devlin ate the sandwich or Devlin completed the course. So this is how we do that. Display. So this is the key. The value for display is an object. Okay. So we have another set of these curly brackets. If you have a code editor that doesn't automatically add that closing bracket, I always recommend that you create the opening curly bracket, skip a line, and add the closing one. Because if you forget to close one of these brackets, you're gonna be in some trouble. So, everyone good on that? Yep. So inside of this, we are going to have a name. Okay. So just like we had a name for our actor, we're going to have a name for this verb. But it's tricky. Okay. So names, no matter what language you're speaking, the name is going to be the same. Okay. Or in most cases, I mean, it seems. So when you're displaying the verb, that might not be the case. For example, we're speaking English, so we have to tell the xAPI statement that this display is the English word for the verb. And to do that, we're going to use another object. Okay, so we're really nesting these objects. You see, we can nest 1,000, an object within an object within an object 1,000 times. We just need to keep track of it. So we added the display property, we created a new object, and then within that, we created another new object called name. Okay, and here's where we set the language. So we use a language code. For US English, it's EN-US, and then we would make the value just whatever we want the verb to be. So in this case, presented. Okay. Here's where you can get those language codes if you want to use a different language. I'm going to pull it up. So I just Googled ISO language codes, and this one right here, it looks like Andiamo, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, .co.uk. I'll link this in the chat. This is where you would pull the language code. So say they were working with Australian English, it would be EN-AU. If we're working with Croatian, it would just be HR. So again, most of us we're dealing with English here, so we'll just leave it as EN-US, but know that you can change this, and you can even add different ones. So say we want to add Croatian, and then this would be whatever the word for presented would be in Croatian. Presented Croatian. I don't know what that is, so I can't add it here. But then when it comes time to analyze the data, you can control which one of these language codes you would want to display in the report. So you could do reports for multilingual audiences. We're going to get rid of that one, and we'll just keep it as the English version. So the name object is closed. The display object is closed. We can also add. Oh, wait a minute. Sorry, guys. We don't need this name one here. This is for when we get into the object. I was like, this seems a little bit too nested. I'm really sorry, everyone. It's simpler than I was explaining. We don't need the name. We just need this. So everyone sees this. All we need is the display property. The value is a single object, and we're going to put that object is in US English, and it's presented. So keeping you on your toes, edit your code to get back down to this. We're about to move on to, so let's make sure everyone gets up to speed. Okay, wait, there's a lot in the chat, so let me catch up really quick. I'm gonna go ahead and no, I'll leave the screen sharing up so you guys can copy this if you need to. Oh, French, yeah, French, good. Okay. Sorry for that minor confusion. For the verb, it's just the ID and display properties. Is everyone up to speed on this? Because we're going to move on to object. This is all we need for verb. So object is a big one, okay? There's a lot of data that we can hold with the object. So we'll start it, as you can probably imagine, with an ID. Okay? So this is the same exact thing for the verbs. It's going to be a unique identifier. There's not really there's not a registry for objects IDs because it's going to depend on what you're creating, you know? This is going to vary. So let me pull an example, actually. I'll pull this example from my xAPI challenges app, which is what that xAPI statement you were looking at comes from. So this is an object ID that I came up with. So you can see it has my domain, so devlinpeck.com. And then we're getting into challenges. It's an xAPI challenge. It's a quiz within that xAPI challenge. This is the name of the quiz. And this is the question. So every time someone answers question 3 in this collect text response quiz, I need to make sure that I'm using this same object ID. Okay, you can set up these URIs however you want. If you try to go to this web page, it's not going to bring you to a live page. Okay, I'm just using this to structure how I identify these questions. These questions don't have a direct URL, so I can't use that. So, you know, if for example, it was an article on my website, I would just use that article URL because it, you know, if I want to say Devlin read this article, I wouldn't want to use some more convoluted URI structure when it already has a URI, which is that public-facing URL. So I hope that makes sense. Again, it has to be unique. Use a domain that you control to set this. A lot of people, when they're just playing around with xAPI, they'll use like example.com/whatever. So, you know, maybe I do / write xAPI statement presentation. So I don't really recommend doing this. If you own a domain, use that. If you're just testing xAPI with your own learning record store, it's fine to use the example.com domain. It's not going to hurt anything. Just don't use this in production environments. It's my recommendation. So now we're going to so I'm going to just undo that. Or actually, no, I'll leave that. Whoops. Because we did say we're presenting, so, you know, I don't have a URI already decided for my presentation. Maybe I'll just change it to this, devlinpeck.com. Okay. So we have the ID for the object, very important. Again, when it comes time to query, we can say we want to see everyone who did any kind of interaction with this specific object. We would use the ID to create that query. So now is when we get into the definition. We want to define this object. So this is another pre-mandated property of the object. So ID, xAPI allows that. Definition, that's allowed as well. Check the chat, make sure everyone's all good. Where does casing matter? I don't think that casing does matter with this. I'm just keeping everything lowercase, but I think with JSON, these are just strings, so I really don't think it would matter. Maybe do a quick, I can do it. Is JSON case sensitive? Case is very important when you're dealing with variables. So we're not there yet. Oh, JSON is case sensitive to field names. So yeah, keep all of this lowercase. That's my recommendation. That's what I've always done. So it does seem like it's case sensitive. I mean, again, just keep it lowercase, best practice. In strings, no. Okay, good. Yeah, thanks for that clarification. I didn't expect it to matter for strings, but good. What can I do instead of storyline? What can I use instead of storyline 360? Again, that's jumping ahead. We're not going to use Storyline right now. You can send statements from anywhere that you can execute JavaScript from. So Captivate, Storyline, a web page. In Storyline, you don't get a URL for each question. Yeah, that's right. That's why we created that other one. Good. So let's keep building out this statement. Let me just pull up my reference to make sure I'm not using any wrong language here. So the definition, it's going to be an object, as you could have guessed. And here's where we add that name property, okay? So to define it, we're going to use a name. We also can use a description. Let me get here. So we'll leave that object blank for now. We're going to add a description. The description is going to be an object as well. And I'll show you this. We have time. We're diving deep here. And it has a type property. Okay. So add this definition object, and we'll have two objects within that, a name object and a description object. And we'll have this type property, and its value is not an object. So take a minute to add these properties. We're building a really in-depth xAPI object here. I mean, I hope I'm not losing anyone. In my tutorial where I talk about this, I think we would have been done already. But I'm just showing you how much data you can add and how much data is defined by the xAPI spec. So some of this type field isn't required, description isn't required, probably name isn't even required, since you really just need this ID. But we're going to add these things to make it easier to read the xAPI statement when you're just a human looking at it. I think the computers probably just need these IDs. So name, it's going to be a language code, and we will call it the write xAPI statement presentation. So, and we can even, you can even keep this on one line too if it's easier to read. I'll show you what that looks like. Oops. But here it is on one line. So the definition, open the curly bracket, close the curly bracket, add the language code, and colon to separate that from the value, which is just write an xAPI statement presentation. That can be whatever you want. Do you guys prefer? I mean, do you guys want me to do you care if I do it on one line or two lines? I mean, you kind of see both here. I don't know if one is a lot easier to read than another. Yeah, you can do this with Storyline 3, Storyline 2. Anywhere that you can execute a JavaScript statement from, you can send xAPI statements. But again, we're not going to actually get to sending the statement until week 3 of this. So in week 2, we're going to look at how we can pull this name and email address from the Storyline course, because obviously you're not going to be manually typing this in every time someone goes through your course. You want them to be able to type it in Storyline or whatever it is, and then we'll automatically populate it in the xAPI statement. So we'll look at how to do that. Do 2 lines or whatever is standard. I don't really know if there is a standard. I mean, I think when people try to make it easy to read, they just split it up like this. So we'll do it like that. Cool. So now we have the description property. So again, these are objects because we want to tell people what language we're working with. So since a description would be defined differently in different languages, it's an object because we want to have this key that tells you what language the description is in. Same with the name, same with the display up here. You get the idea. So description is, we'll say it's the first presentation in the xAPI plus Storyline Crowdcast series. So, this can be whatever you want. It's just a way to provide more context for the xAPI for the object, so that when a human's looking at this, they can look at this and be like, oh, okay, yeah, right, I remember what that is, instead of having to try to make sense of a URL that they may or may not have written, and that may or may not be very intuitive. So that is good. And now the type property. So we're using this type property because, look here, we're going to add something beneath ID. So objects can be many things, okay? In all of the examples I've been giving, the object is an activity. So it's an activity to, this write xAPI statement presentation is an activity because, you're attending it, you're interacting with it. But the object can also be a person, which would be an actor themselves. So I could say Devlin greeted Susie. So in that case, Susie would be the object, or Devlin coached John, or whatever it is. So the object in that case wouldn't be an activity. You can also do things with that gets more complex. We're not going to dive into that here. In 90% plus of cases, the object type will be an activity. So we're going to add this property here. And again, this is getting more advanced, but still, it's good to know. I just wanted to show you this, and don't forget to add the comma. So this is an activity. This isn't a required part. Again, it's just to add more context to the statement, make there be less possibilities for it to be confused with something else. So this is an activity, and now this is where we can say what type of activity it is. So I'm going to go back over to the registry, and let's see, and that type will be a URI. And you might have noticed at the very top of the registry, we have this right here, activity types. So we're not looking for a verb URI, we're looking for an activity type. And this is a presentation. Let's see. Not a conference, not really a conference session. So we don't have just a presentation option. What I would normally do is look through here, talk, speech. I'm not coming up with anything. So if this is a case, I mean, I'm sure there is something in here that we would want to use that would fit for this. But let's see. So I mean, this is what I would do. Like I would control find it for the words I think they would use, but then I would still want to look. I mean, a conference session, a single presentation, discussion, gathering, or panel within a conference. So this wouldn't exactly be that because this isn't really a conference. So I wouldn't want to use that. But you get the idea. I mean, if there isn't one already defined, you can create your own. So this would be spec.com/presentation. And then maybe I do or maybe I don't post a page on my website where I explain how to use this verb and how I use it, so that if someone else was going to use xAPI with my domain, it would be standardized and they wouldn't use a different URI to refer to this. So let's check the chat. Oh, thank you for linking that. Is something required in line 11? Okay, so line 11, we don't need a comma because there's nothing else. We're not adding another thing here. If we were adding something else like new object, and then we added something here, we would need a comma. But because this is the end of the object, you do not need a comma. You see with this one, verb is an object. We have a comma after this because object is the next object. You see? So you only need the commas when you're displaying a list of things. And there's no list here, so we don't need a comma there. Okay. So let us see. I think this is it for object. So again, this was much more complex than much more complex than my tutorial. Does anyone want me to elaborate on any of these properties, or do we want to move on? We have 15 minutes. We can dive into it's a more advanced part of an xAPI statement. We can dive into context. Oh no, result actually. I think we should dive into result. So let's see. So active verb and object, these are the only 3 parts of an xAPI statement that you need. But another really important one that you'll probably want to include is the result object. But let's see this question. Why does type have no curled brackets? It's because this is a URI, a unique universal resource identifier. This isn't something in plain language. So we don't need to have a key here that says it's in English. You only need to have, so it doesn't need to be an object. Because again, objects contain key value pairs. We need that key value pair so that the key can be what language we're dealing with, and the value can be the actual words that we want people to read. For type, it's just a URI or a URL, so we don't need to say what language that's in. I hope that helps. Cool. Okay, so let's move on. So when we add another object, the result object is a child of this statement itself. And just to refresh on how children work, actor is an object of the statement itself. Name is a child of actor. So actor is name's parent. This is coding terminology. You'll probably want to be familiar with it. Mbox is a child of actor. Can anyone tell me in the chat what's the parent for this right here? For this key value pair, or you know, this is a child of display. Yeah. So you see how that works. So we want to make sure that when we add the result object, we're doing so as a child to the overall statement. So we'll look at where this object ends, which is down here, almost the last curly bracket. Visual Studio Code and most other good code editors are nice because they'll highlight where that object ends. So that's where we'll add our comma and then add the next object. So you see how we did that? Display. Yeah, good job. Cool. Oh, hi, Cassie. All right. So the result object is where we're going to hold quiz data. It's going to be where we hold success data about whether or not someone successfully passed a quiz or a question or an experience. And it's where we can hold response data so that we can see the exact responses that people made to a given question. So let's dive into it. There's a lot here. I'll try to cover it fairly quick. I mean, I think you guys get the basics now. We already covered the hardest concepts, I'd say. So the first part of this, again, the order isn't important, and all of these are optional. So this entire object is optional. Each of these things, each of these objects within the result object are also optional, not required, but it's good because it does hold important information about the xAPI statement. So we'll add this score object. And there are 4 different properties we can hold here. So we can hold the min score, which will just be min. We'll say the minimum is 0. It can hold the max score. We'll say the max score is 10. It can hold the raw score. So this is the raw score that the user has at this point in time. So say we're on question 5 and we've answered all 5 questions correctly so far. Our raw score would be 5. And now our scaled score, it would be like what our actual, how many did we get right out of how many total questions there are. And this is reflected as a decimal. So since we have 5 questions right so far out of 10, our scaled score would be 0.5. So these are the 4 different elements of that score object. If you have any questions about that, let me know. If not, you could, you can copy this. But again, it's pretty intuitive. What's the minimum possible? What's the max possible? What do we have now? And what is that as a decimal, represented as a decimal? Okay. I don't see anything in the chat, so we're going to move on to the next part of this. We can also hold duration data. Oh, this is my favorite. I think I always say this in my tutorials. It's so cool. Yeah. I mean, you can use xAPI to see how long someone's spending on a slide, on the entire course, on a given question, how long they looked at a specific part of a specific resource for. So duration data is really exciting, but it's expressed in a somewhat weird way. It's in this special ISO format, and it's basically like this. It's like period of time, and then we would say like 30 seconds. Okay, so it's has PT before it, and then you would have the number. So say we have 1 hour, 30 minutes, and 30 seconds. So, it looks kind of confusing if you're not familiar to looking at this, but I could post a resource. Let me see. I'll probably want to get into how we do this once we get to that tutorial. That's going to be like week 6, I think, of this. But it took me a little bit to Google this and figure out how to do this the right way. So I'm not going to dive too far into it. But, this is a simple way to look at it. Period of time of 30 seconds. That's how long it took the user to answer this question. That doesn't make sense in this context because we're viewing I'm presenting this. That's our xAPI statement. It wouldn't make sense to have score data associated with that. But, I just want to show you how we can work with this object. So that's duration. Let's look at response. So this is another good one. This is where you can see what the user responded. So say we asked a question about, What is a JSON object, or what does JSON stand for? One of our options might be JavaScript Object Notation. And you know, we would program that in whatever tool we're using to set this response based off of what they click, or better yet, say you have an open text response and say, oh, what do you like about JSON? It's like, I like that it's easy. You know, whatever the user types in, you can capture that and include it in an xAPI statement. And this is where you would do it on this response property right here. And then I don't have it in my thing here, but also the success property. So I think this would just be true or false. Maybe I want to double check that. xAPI result success. So here's how I would double check something like that. It's like, you know, I've used it before. I'm pretty confident of where it is. But because all this stuff needs to be so precise and in line with the specification and put in the right place, I'm always double checking just to avoid issues down the line. So again, I'm on one of these, the deep dive for the result object. Here's success. Yep, the success property takes a Boolean value, which just means a true or false value. So, and when you're looking at that in the LRS, it will translate into whether the user passed that object or failed that object. And, you know, they usually have, oh, they don't have any code samples here, but good stuff. So we would add the success property as well. Any questions about this? This is mandated. So you do need to use this language. This is predetermined by the xAPI spec. You would want to capture the individual's response. It's not to the xAPI statement, it's to whatever the activity is. So say the activity is, you know, a question, like a question in a course. What's the answer to this? This is in a storyline course. Whatever, you would want to know what the user selects. You don't just want to know whether they got it right or wrong. You want to know what their actual response was. And say, like, a really cool example for this is something I want to build a template for, a tutorial for. You can add a feedback widget to your storyline course that sits on the bottom of every slide. And when the user clicks it, it can say like, oh, what's your feedback? And the user can type in their feedback and click send. And then you can pull the slide they were on. You can see all of the past, you can see exactly which actions they took leading up to that. And you can actually capture that feedback that they typed in the course with this, you know, and this is where you would put it in the xAPI statement. So I hope that answers your question, Cassie, but feel free to ask a follow-up. I don't understand how URIs work in this context. What does the code do with the URI? Does it create a new folder where it saves the data? The data is just saved as this. The data is only saved as an entire object like this. There's no new folders, nothing like that. This JSON data is just put onto a server. That's xAPI. It's really simple. The reason you need these URIs is so that the LRS knows when it's dealing with the same thing. You know, I need to put this ID for this presentation I'm giving because I wouldn't want to give this presentation again down the line and call it something different. Or I wouldn't want to say that, you know, Susie viewed the presentation and I use this ID, and then someone else uses it and I'm using a different ID. Then when it comes time to say, oh, show me everyone who completed this presentation, the only way to look at that is by just putting in this URI. So you want to make sure everything that you're identifying as the same thing uses the same URI. That's the most important consideration with URIs. Eventually, the response value will be a variable that gets defined by storyline, but we're using it to set it. Yeah, we're just putting this in here because it's going to wind up being a string. But yeah, we're going to get into how we actually pull this from a storyline course down the line. That's like week 5, I believe. So in week 5, we'll look at how we can pull this from a storyline course. We're not doing that right now. This session is just to show you how everything is structured, what type of data you can include in an xAPI statement. Hopefully, get you familiar with JSON. So we covered a lot of ground here. There are a couple of more possible options here. So there's context, and that's an object, and you can include information about the parents and the children. So let me just show you how I did that here. So we're going to take another look at this xAPI statement that I showed you in the beginning, and I want to see how comfortable everyone's feeling with it now. So let's see. So data search. So here's that xAPI statement. So you see this ID. So look at it now already. I'm betting a lot of you feel like you're on some more familiar ground than you were an hour ago. This ID property, that's a unique ID for the statement itself. And I just let the LRS handle that. The learning record store will automatically generate that. So you don't need to worry about that when you're writing the statements. So look here, look at what we have. So, we can see, oh yeah, this is a single agent we're dealing with. I'm not collecting the user's names for this app. So I just put in user because the name isn't important, but the mailbox is important because that's how we're differentiating these actors. So, take a look. How do you guys feel about this now when you're looking at this? Are you able to see kind of what's happening here? So again, this is an ID. I just pulled this from the registry. You can see the language code. I answered something. I answered question 3. How are we defining this object? Its name is question 3. It's a question in the collect text response quiz. I can see what type of activity this is. It's a question. So, here's a unique ID for it that I copied over earlier. Yep, definitely. Cool. So yeah, so I hope looking at this, you feel a lot less intimidated. Again, it's just simple brackets, colons, and quotation marks. Here's the result. So you can see how I did. See, I have 100%. This is a decimal. I scored 3 out of 3, so I did good here. It took me 17 seconds to answer this question. This is the actual response. It looks codey, but this is like the actual response to the question because it is based on xAPI stuff. Again, we get here in week 5. And this is context. So I want to cover this really quickly. You can show how this activity, this question, is related to other activities. Again, this probably looks confusing. We're not going to get too far into it, but you can say that, okay, the parent for this activity is actually this entire quiz. Okay. So this is a question. Above that sits the quiz, and then it's grouped. It's related to the xAPI Challenges app, which isn't open to the public yet. This is some more stuff that gets automatically generated by the learning record store. It says when this was generated, when it was actually stored by the learning record store. This is some authority information. Nothing you need to worry about. It's handled by the learning record store. Most every statement you'll want to send, you're going to be dealing with these 4 objects. Context is important too, but we'll get into that another time. Whew, that was a lot. We covered a ton of ground. Oh, the scaled. Yeah, the scaled score is just the user's raw score divided by the maximum score. So if I get 10 out of 10, my scaled score is 1. If I only get 5 out of 10, 5 divided by 10 is 0.5. So my scaled score is 0.5. When you translate that into a percentage, it's just 50%. So that's how the scaled score works. I understand this better than 4 years of reading, webinars, workshops, etc. Thanks. Yeah, no problem. Scaled was 0.5 because the maximum score was 10 and the raw score was 5. So cool. So again, this is only week 1. It's only going to get better from here. We're going to start actually sending that xAPI data. Oh, I'm sorry. I see some questions in the Ask a Question feature, but I think I covered all of that. There's an xAPI Challenges app that mirrors these challenges we're discussing. So I'm starting a second pilot for that app next week, and then it's going live. And that's a place where you can kind of answer quizzes, and there's a leaderboard in the app, so you can kind of get some recognition for your xAPI skills. So if you are interested in helping out with that pilot and getting involved, just hop on my mailing list if you aren't already. I know a decent number of you are already involved with that, so thank you for the help. And that app and this Crowdcast and all of the tutorials and everything I'm doing, I do want to keep it completely free so it's accessible as possible to everyone, but it does run on donations. It's expensive to keep all this software up and running. So if this did bring value for anyone, it would be appreciated if you contributed even $1 or $2. No pressure. Feel free to wait, a couple more sessions, because if you learned a lot this session, you're going to learn a lot about JavaScript, Storyline, and xAPI as we go. But yeah, that is a wrap. Reach out to me on LinkedIn, email, my website. I'm not hard to find. And the next Crowdcast session is already up. So if you want to go ahead and register for next Thursday's session, we're going to dive right back into it. And we're going to look at how we can collect the name and email address from a Storyline course. So cool. I hope to see you all there. Thank you for the turnout. Yeah, we had between 50 and 60 people here this whole time. So good stuff. Stay in touch. See you next week. Help out with the app if you want, and reach out anytime. Bye, everybody. Thanks.